The issue, therefore, is that if that data is not working for the farmer, then who's it working for? Therefore, I think there is a huge space for, I would imagine, civil society organizations who don't have vested interest to take up that space to create an innovation along the lines.
Welcome everyone. My name is Shatadru. We are initiating this new broadcast or podcast called EcoPulse, Navigating Sustainable Future. This is something we have been thinking about for a very long time. The space of sustainability is very rapidly changing. It's a very dynamic space. And this decade, we have witnessed that we are moving towards multiple different facets of sustainability which were not witnessed in previous decades. Within that, there are two most important elements which requires deeper attention, deeper understanding. One aspect of it is related to the entire space of data. The data space is emerging as a very important and very critical aspect, even though it was there, the data was there right from the time of the Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerians used to maintain database of agriculture, but from those 3,500 years back to BC to present time, things have shifted dramatically. Today we talk about traceability. Today we talk about agri-technology. We talk about blockchains. All this, and then you have the other dimension which is coming up is related to carbon. Carbon has become a very important element because of the different commitments made by businesses and the governments related to the scope 3 reductions, keeping the global climate within certain limited limits of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. All this has created a kind of question about how do these things impact smallholders? What are the ethical issues which we need to address? How does civil society organization react to that? Are the issues the same in global south compared to what we see as prioritization in the west, as we call it? So all these questions, for that I have today with us Ayan Banerjee as the guest with me. Ayan is presently the Managing Director for Asia in Practical Action, a noted global civil society organization. Ayan has graduated from London School of Economics as a development economics practitioner. He did his management from Columbia Business School, and he has specialized in impact investment from University of Oxford. He was very highly successful agri-tech entrepreneur in the United States, and I remember as an old friend, he gave up everything to jump into the space of development cooperation, trying to work with the smallholder farmers in the cotton sector, eventually becoming the most well-known proponent probably in the country on the fair trade, drawing his experiences of working as the CEO of Fair Trade International Asia Pacific Regency, and as well as from its Fair Trade's founding organization in Solidaridad. So a warm welcome to you, Ayan.
Thank you so much, Shatadru. I mean, thank you so much for your very, very kind words. And to be honest, it's a privilege to be able to have this conversation. And first guest, as you said, we've known each other for about 13, 14 years now, and kind of in one way or another, I've both admired and appreciated the work of Solidaridad and your leadership in particular. Just to be clear, I've always considered you as a friend, philosopher, guide, and mentor. And it's been a great privilege to work alongside with you when the time that we worked in Solidaridad.
Thank you, Ayan. I mean, I think the admiration is mutual. We've learned from each other. Now, what we find, it's a very interesting domain of the data. Primarily, it has been driven in the recent time by some of the legislations in Europe. For example, the European Union Green Deal, the European Union's the due diligence laws, traceability, in which traceability requirement is very critical. It is also driven by the requirement to be net zero, and therefore each of them are driven by data. On the other hand, what we are seeing is in this data space, if I have to narrow it down to agriculture in per se, you see two dimensions. One side is complete capturing of private sector, the space of data. They do it through innovation, privacy laws, or various mechanisms. Or on the other hand, you find another side is extreme level of data nationalism, which is by the governments capturing entire space of data, not allowing anybody else, and it could become a potential tool for autocratic control of data. Between these two extremes, somewhere there is a debate about the necessity of fairness of data. And as a proponent of fair trade for decades, where you have seen fair trade in commodities, do you see the fair data? Can there be, if data could be considered as a commodity, how can we consider this interplay between fair trade as it is today and fair data, which it should be?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Sharatu, because if you remember when we were kind of coming up with the concept of fair data in itself, I think it was even before the European Union started with this, the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I think the fundamental premise of that discussion has to be, who is it fair for, and who are you trying to be fair to? A significant part of our work revolves, as civil society, as an international organization. Our interest was to protect the interests of the farmers. Sometimes farmers can speak for themselves, but very often a lot of the data that we collect as the development sector, that is very useful for donors, and it's very useful for private sector engagement. But eventually, is the data of a high enough quality to plow back as benefits to the farmers? So even if we talk about whether that data is findable for who? Can the farmer find their own data? Do they know that 3 years ago what pesticides they had bought or not bought? So a lot of times the pieces of those data are either sitting with private sector partners, sometimes even the government, because a lot of that is under regulation. The land rights, for instance, we've struggled to even for farmers to find the basic data, and very often the question is, who's the farmer? The woman who's tilling the land, or the name of a husband or a father or the brother in whose name the land is, because that's what your laws ask you to do. So even the fundamental point is defining your farmer, the age profile, etc., etc. A lot of that data in itself is distorted. That data is highly incomplete, inaccurate, and the issue therefore is that if that data is not working for the farmer, then who's it working for? Therefore, I think there is a huge space for, I would imagine, civil society organization who don't have vested interests to take up that space to create an innovation along the lines. Now, Sharad, you mentioned that data is like a commodity, and it was long since, I think it's almost now a cliche to say data is the new oil. But then oil is also not a good word to use, because we are moving away from that oil and that exploitive nature, and therefore a lot of the greening it. So I think a lot of the impact washing, as it were, is based on data. And again, while a lot of the data is useful to report back and to promote, very often we see large private sector companies doing 1% of the work on some element of that, producing that huge amount of data, magnifying their social returns on investments, etc., which is not really the case. So I think there is a huge space to create data that works, and predominantly it should be data that works.
Very interesting, Ayan. And both you and me have been practitioners in the space of certification and sustainability connected to certification system. Now, if I have to kind of draw some analogies from the real commodity world, agricultural commodity world with the data world, what we are seeing in the commodity world, there are like two kind of processes. One is to try to do some incremental changes within a kind of a liberal capitalist order, where you can bring in certain changes, and that's, we call it as a step-by-step improvement or incremental improvement. Various certification standards are kind of testament to that, which also emerge as a kind of where the governments were kind of withdrawing from the role when in the post 1989 1991 onwards. On the other hand, you are also seeing a new movement happening, including fair trade, which tried to create an alternative supply chain. And that was trying to showcase that another way of doing business is possible. It's another thing that it has moved in a different direction now. Uh, but nonetheless, when we see the new concepts emerging today about democratic economy, about an alternative economic model which would challenge the existing economic model, like the producers could come together and create mechanism. When I draw this analogy in the data space and see, there are two possibilities. One is that NGOs do not, or civil society organizations do not have capacity to invest funds, uh, develop. This is getting so obsolete in so quick, rapid space that, and sometimes it is it's called designed obsolescence. So within 2 3 years, a technology will be designed to not to work further. It becomes very difficult for an NGO to, or a civil society organization to do that. On the other hand, is it possible for the farmers group, the civil society, to develop an alternative data ecosystem as a challenge to the existing order, which is kind of driven by large companies who are trying to, who have every wherewithal, including the government policy space, which is more enabler for such large companies to operate? What would be your, if you have to draw your analogy from the commodity world, how would you look at it?
Yeah. So it's interesting, Shaladu, you should mention this. Um, so I have long since wondered about this, and again, I have my prejudice because I believe that, with all their faults, I think the cooperative movement is actually very powerful. Let's say an institution through which impact as well as benefits to the members can be created. A lot of cooperatives, particularly in India, but also more widely in Asia, have been promoted either by traders, as a backward integration, or as a channel. There is a huge amount of civil society influence, and also propagating, mushrooming, the farmer producer organizations in India, which were all set up. The one that I worked in, Chetna, with cotton farmers, was supported by Solidaridad, for instance. And again, the history of cooperatives is very robust. So when I was in banking, one of the things that in 2007, 2008, it was saying that, oh, this large capitalist, etc., is not working. The regulation is not working. Government institutional mechanisms are not working. Finance is not working. And there was a lot of research, again, like I said, with their own faults, which was trying to look at an alternative paradigm. That paradigm is cooperatives. So I started working directly with cooperatives to see, where is that element of truth. Now, the example, Shaladru, you've given is very interesting, because you're talking about the social dimension of it. The other side of this data story is the neoliberal entry point, where people are constantly trying to see, okay, now how do we get impact investing? How do we commercialize this? How do we get investments, and get more investments, get higher valuation? What does this data mean for us, etc.? So that goes into different trajectory, almost that beaten down trajectory. Obviously, governments will have a space to control and regulate the data. Obviously, we're seeing that happening across the world. It's whether in the more, I would say, even the most democratic of societies happening, as well as if you look at the far left, it is bound to happen. So there's a space for that capturing of that data, with an interest to control, but also to regulate how that data is being used. There is also a space for cooperatives, I think, to better use that data, because as members, they understand their members, and data can be a mechanism to strengthen the cooperatives. One of the things that I learned was that sometimes we didn't have sufficient high quality data. The data is, it has those 5 V's, as it's called, and we didn't have high density, high quality data. So farmers, even in cooperatives, were giving the data if they felt like, or they said that, well, we don't want to give the data. So I think we need to move to an innovation in data, where that you set a template to say that, okay, this is the kind of data, and this is what you'll get out of should you choose to share the data.
Thank you, Ayan. I think it's, again, if I have to bring in a kind of an analogy, and I'm trying to bring in different analogies, because it's so fascinating to connect with what we have been practicing, both of us, for more than 2 decades, and how they kind of completely connect with each other. For example, there has been a issue when you are engaging with the agriculture. If you buy a particular product, the certification did not give any value to the farmers. It's now proven, various certification, with probably some exceptions of fair trade. But in general speaking, the business case was never there for the smallholder farmers. What we also find is that, at least what we have experienced working with hundreds of thousands of farmers, the business case for agri technology is also not coming out very, very clearly. It's a bit like the same space where we found ourselves. But in this kind of a milieu, I find the situation a bit like pre-fair trade time, when the business of business was to do business or bring shareholders profit. There was no principle about fairness. And then, irrespective of whether fair trade transformed the market or not, but it created a value. And subsequently, as we call it in Solidaridad, through pyramid of change, right from the consumer as a driver in the fair trade to leading businesses as driver in initiatives like UT certification, Rainforest Alliance, to a base of the pyramid where you see the round tables were playing a role. It created a certain value. Now, in the space of data, do you feel there is a necessity of another kind of a movement, and which will create that value? Because today the space is valueless. There is no clarity about what is fairness, who should decide fairness. The most of the discussion when you have in fair data or fairness, it's all about interoperability, reduction in cost, quality of data, etc. Very technical jargon. So that's one part of my question. And the second part is, in all this whole thing, first, I think we did an injustice to smallholders by bringing in huge amount of technical jargon and certifications, which took decades for them to understand. Chain of custody, farm diary, and so on, so forth. This poor farmer had never seen those stuff, that they have to do. And now we are bringing in the technical jargons, and it's sort of taking the issues completely out of their hand and placing it in the hands of few people who decides what is fairness, what is a timestamp on a data, etc. How do we ensure that the technicality is not used as a mechanism, a subtle mechanism for exclusion?
No, that's a tough one, because technicality is always used as a tool to distinguish between those who have and have not. And data is, an instrument, or information, knowledge. They are instruments of the segregation into classes. So, data, knowledge, information have also been used to, create a new world order, including a recolonization, for instance, right? So who controls the data, and where is the data control, and where are the data centers, etc. And again, you're right, the third party certification, I think, have had their value, definitely, because they were creating a space which didn't exist before. So the proof of concept, the proof of value has been created. But again, it has been limited in the sense that it doesn't, leave no one behind. For instance, if you are going to follow it, then, certification has left huge number of people behind, covering a very small, important, but from a numbers perspective, an insignificant set of numbers. I feel that there is a space for, I think, civil society organizations in particular, along with, let's say, the technocrats, the agri entrepreneurs, for instance, to come together and create a platform. What we will not solve, however, is the sense of capacity, because I think very few people really understand. If you look into the people who are actually at the helm of what is data, they are either at universities with at least one or two PhDs, a step away from Nobel laureate. That league of people really understand, but then they're far from being practitioners for most often. And most of us who are practitioners want to understand a lot of the social implication, the technical terms, social impact. So for that to translate, like people say, speak to me as though I'm five, it becomes a very difficult conversation. And the question, therefore, is twofold. One is, if the value of that data, let's assume in financial terms, plows back to a farmer, to somebody else, to what extent would they need to know that? So if you can assure an element of certainty in their income, so what you cannot tell them is that this data is valuable if XYZ number of things happen, and the more number of variables you create, then the flow of that value becomes very variable. So it has to be some sort of a, in financial terms, what we say is some sort of a swap, where you swap the uncertainty of cash flows to a fixed certainty of cash flows and tell the farmers that no matter what, a bit like almost like a steady stream of income for them, is this is what we're going to be able to offer you. The risk of any innovation, whether on data or anything else, should never be sitting with the farmers, simply because the risk should be taken by those who understand them or seemingly understand them more. And I think as long as the benefit is accrued to the farmers and not to, let's say, the consulting firms or the investment bankers or even the NGOs who are creating all this innovation, the larger part of the benefit you can demonstrate plows back to the farmers. I think that's a good business case. What we have seen, whether in certification or investment banking or in consulting, is that there is a huge proliferation of multitude of benefit, multi-million dollar industries which are being created. And there is the trickle down effect of the value to the farmer is so small, it's about 5 or 10%, which means there is a 90% of the value which is being appropriated by, again, for want of a better phrase, the middlemen who are creating a lot of these interesting cases.
Yeah, and so it's very interesting. What you are suggesting is probably a kind of a fair value of data, which should be provided in a format which is easy to apply, addressing the issue of technological exclusion. So and we have seen this happening in some spaces, like in fair trade itself. You pay a premium, you pay a fixed price, and on the top of the premium. So are you suggesting something similar could be done if a certain kind quality of data could be generated at the farmer place?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, well, so multiple levels, right? Obviously, there is an informed consent element to that entire conversation. So farmer must be aware to the extent that we are aware. So we have to say it in simple terms to say that what we are doing with the data, the last thing you want is, let's say, private sector enterprises taking that farmer data and selling it and reselling it to say that, okay, this data is great value. I have 100,000 farmer database. How much are you going to pay for it? And again, this happens, it's probably happening to you and me, with our telephone number or our internet footprint. So there is a lot of profiling. There are organizations which are doing it. But I think given the fact that farmers are vulnerable at-risk population, I think there is a play for both the government and therefore regulation as well as civil society to protect those interests. And again, yes, one is obviously there should be a premium, so there should be a value that should be accrued to the farmer, whether you pay it in a sort of monthly basis or premium basis, so that value should be known to the farmer. Two, I think the one of the things that we have experienced, Shatadru, is that we used to go to the field to collect the data. 1 month later, somebody else is collecting the data. 3 months later, somebody else is collecting the same data, and the farmer is just circulating the same data. And in Hindi, you used to say, "Hamare paas kaam nahi hai kya sab?" Somebody, do we not have any other work to do because somebody or the other is collecting the same set of data? And I think that's the element of the reusability element which becomes important. But no matter, and every time anybody uses it, there should be a money or a benefit which should go back for using that data back to the farmer, either in terms of direct financial benefits, but also in terms of superior quality of services. So if I know what the farmer has purchased and that is doing a certain things about the land, and we want to encourage the farmer towards a regenerative agriculture in the longer interest of the land, then we say that, you've been using XYZ pesticides and insecticides. This is what it's done to your land. Do you want to look at an alternative?
Very interesting. I will come to regenerative agriculture in just 1 minute. But we have one last question on this part, Ayan, because this is related to the new aspect which is coming up is in the form of artificial intelligence. And I was reading today about this software or the application called Replica, where you can kind of make the replica in such a way that it can resemble any person. So I can make you actually, using your document, and it will respond in a similar fashion that you respond. So this could be very helpful in agriculture if you can mimic some of the top scientists in the world who could be where a farmer could ask, every farmer having their farm support or farm guru or farm professor whom they could ask questions and they could respond. On the other hand, we face a kind of a unique dilemma. We also saw Prime Minister Modi's concern about artificial intelligence today. He said that's one of the biggest challenges we were of this decade. But I mean, without going into science fiction stuff like whether the machines are going to take over, etc., like what we saw in our younger days in the Terminator movies, uh, maybe we should talk a little bit about the trolley problem we are facing in the Google cars. The question is when the autonomous cars are moving, whether it's the driver or a child which has come on the way. The question is who programs that decision making. Similarly, in agriculture, when you have what would the if I have to look at a trolley problem here would be uh, whether we should increase yield at all cost or we should take care of the soil and we take care of the water. Who decides that? How do you see this dilemma?
Yeah, so from what I know, the trolley problem really doesn't have a solution. It just poses a huge number of problems, and the problems are essentially the short term versus long term, individual versus multiple people, and kind of poses very difficult ethical dilemmas to be solved.
Doesn't the trolley problem requires the fairness treatment?
And that's the exact dilemma, right? So you have from whose eyes. The question is that what's useful for, let's say, one farmer. He may say that I need a cash flow tomorrow because I need to marry off my daughter. There are dowries which in the social element. Now somebody may say, oh well, dowry in itself is wrong. Yeah, but that's not the right problem that you're solving. The other element of this conversation is the governments could be saying that for the state or for the country or for the region or for the crop, whatever lens you take, we need to look at a larger canvas. But for that, you need to compensate the individual farmers. If you want people to look beyond individuals, and there is a reason why we are all individuals, then you need to compensate to say that, okay, you want to look at the greater common good, then you need to do it. Now, Shatadru, in all honesty, you and I can probably afford to do it because we come from a place of, let's say, privilege. We are educated, we have the backgrounds, so we can give a heart, mind, soul to this. But for a farmer who's, literally very often living on daily wages, it's a daily cost, it's daily grind. Cash flows are, once a season, 90 days, 100 days, or actually 120 days because they never get their money on time. It's not fair for us to probably ask them. This discussion that I said is not fair is my judgment. I should be asking the farmer, putting the trolley problem for them. I should be asking the governments. Somebody should be asking and addressing those questions that, to what extent is it fair? What you rightly said is that sometimes, looking at the longer perspective is not always beneficial. Sometimes it's very useful and helpful, but sometimes it's probably detrimental because that longer term perspective never comes. As Kane said, in the long term, we are all dead. So it's probably one of those things that, you want to push back a decision and say it's a long term decision. But for a lot of people, and especially the most vulnerable, it's probably not that much of a long-term decision.
I think on this part, we can conclude about three critical aspects which is coming out from the discussion and from what you just mentioned. One is that uh, there is a necessity to have certain fairness values for data. Fairness from different perspective, but nonetheless there has to be some fairness where there is a role for every stakeholder, from farmers to the other players, which could drive us towards a global governance or a global mechanism of description of fairness. Whether it happens through voluntary mechanism or a mandatory mechanism, we don't know yet, but it is necessary to have certain fairness principle which doesn't exist today. It exists in the form of technical interpretations, and that should be inclusive, fair, and it should be transparent. The second you mentioned, and what came out through the discussion, is there has to be a fair value. And fair value would be described through, discussions, through the quality of the data, the effort who has been put in, and the farmer should be, not the risk taker. They are provider. The third aspect, which we also discussed, is about, who decides about what needs to be done. And that's the very complex problem which we are facing, because all along, while we are talking about data, we were still talking about data in the hands of human realm. Now the things that are happening is that the data is no longer in the hands of human realm. It is getting into the AI system, where it is possible that it will kind of recreate its own system. And imagine if a situation where the AI takes a decision that it's not really worthy enough or worthwhile to do tea in India.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. So I mean, in that element, Shatadru, we mentioned about fair data. With the huge amount of data, there is also false data. So we are seeing a lot of things. The cases with the large social media in that sense is that there was a huge amount of data, and then they changes election results. And the problem that with the farmer is that it can, in a country like India, where about 700 million people are engaged in agriculture directly, it is a massive change for the world. And again, if that data is not accurate, if that data is not transparent, if that processing of that data becomes into a black box, and again, most machine learning algorithms by design are not what we call traceable. Therefore, the degree of the trust that you can have on the algorithm itself, it does a lot of things, but you actually don't know which parameter is it particularly influencing, etc., etc. So while a lot of that machine learning algorithms are useful to give you a final product, when it goes through a black box and says, okay, this is a finished product, but you don't know why that recommendation is coming. The other interesting element, since you mentioned about AI, obviously, is that it's garbage in, garbage out, which means if you're fed data which is misogynist, for instance, then you will have AI recommending a misogynist solution. If you have a data which is already reflecting, inequities in our society, then it's going to aggravate that rather than solve it. So there is a space for a conscious lever to correct some of these things which have happened, especially in the post-colonial era, with the way we have led the world. The question, therefore, again goes back to your trolley problem: is who's going to correct it? Who's responsible to correct it? What is the how? Who gives who that responsibility to correct it? And I think there's a space for governments, regulators, civil society to come into that platform to say that this is probably what needs to be done.
This has been a perennial question about who decides, and that is directly connected to what ideological perspective you have, how you see the world. If you are having a neoliberal perspective, you will look at it in a certain way. And there are a lot of things which are happening now, like data socialism is coming up and those kind of terminologies. If you have a socialistic perspective, there is a different way of looking at things. So I think the civil societies will have a very, very important role to determine where do they stand ideologically. What we have also witnessed in the last few, maybe last decade or so, is that sort of an end of history for the civil society movement as well. And therefore, and I think they need to be very, very clear. If they have to play a role in the space of data, they need to be clear where do they stand ideologically to precisely decide on this trolley problem.
You're absolutely right. And it's, to be honest, it's not like the civil society in itself has solved the problem that they find themselves redundant. I mean, that should have been the original intention. The problem has shifted, which means we still have problems in society. We are not going to achieve the SDGs by any stretch of imagination. Therefore, this creation or recreation of the problem statement, reformulation of the problem statement, finding new and innovative ways to solve it. And increasingly, also, you're absolutely right, in the last 10 years, at least in Asian context, we have seen that many governments have taken the center stage in regulating the civil society in itself. While regulation is good, but I think throttling is a bit of a problem, because civil society, many organizations may be activists, but the kind of background, our organizations, we work with the government to influence and support and help the government to deliver on their mission, which is for the social good. For that's their primal responsibility. So I think, again, I keep saying that the government should also be engaging more with us, and we should also be sitting in some of those discussions to work with the government on those policy elements as well.
That is a nice bridge to the next subject, where the farmers were initially only the providers of the products. Now today this entire data ecosystem is kind of getting this tailwind primarily because of these laws which were passed in Europe, the European Green Deal, European deforestation regulation, due diligence regulation, so on and so forth. There are five or six of those, components to the Green Deal. And the most important one is where the businesses, the directors are directly responsible for showing traceably from whether there are any violation of decent work or deforestation related issues on their supply chain, and they are personally liable for in order to supply products to the European markets. The other thing which has also happened, mostly it took kind of a lot of momentum from the Glasgow summit for environmental summit. It started from Paris, but in Glasgow it really took the momentum, where the corporate world took up this science-based target for addressing the whole, and then they all come up with a net zero commitment. Pepsi, Nestle, 2040, Unilever, everybody, all the big food companies have come up with their net zero commitment. Some 2030, some 2040, some even 2050. Uh, the interesting thing is that it was the scope 3 has been brought in, and for the audience who are wondering what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, scope 1 is directly related to reduction in emissions at your own facilities. Scope 2 is about reduction of emissions in your direct suppliers, and scope 3 is reduction or reaching the net zero carbon emissions from your indirect suppliers. So this is how it is worked. So there is a mapping which is done about how much of deficiency of your carbon is available, that is using science-based target. They have there are cool farm tools used in order to measure what was lacking. So each of the companies have actually measured their deficiencies, and now they are asking. So there are two things which are emerging. On the one hand, there is a huge growth in voluntary carbon market. Now, the voluntary carbon market, again, for the ease of audience, we have to make quickly that it is like, when you travel by the plane, you are asked to pay some money in order to, you know, plant one or two trees so that it can kind of take care of the environmental losses you are making due to the flying or due to the burning of the fuel. So it's sort of that, it's a compensation. So that's the voluntary market. And then there is this insetting, so that's the offsetting part. Then there is an insetting part where a company tries to kind of clean up their own plate and basically achieve net zero within their supply chain. Now, in these circumstances, come back to the situation of a farmer, which we represent in a way, working for them, both of us. These guys are suddenly feel that they are in a Star Trek movie. So they say, guys, how do you get carbon out of air? What are you talking about? I know how to grow tomatoes. I know how to grow apple. I know how to grow potatoes. But now you are asking me to produce carbon in my farm. So, how do you see this situation about the farmers in the south are now become custodians of not only of our food security but also environmental security? Is it fair?
It's a very good question, Sharadu. So first and foremost, I think the EU laws, all the gamut of laws about the OECD due diligence, etc. I think they are welcome, because one of the things that we have experienced is the big guys really putting plausible deniability, saying that we don't know, what's happening in the field. Okay, so there are social problems in tea, yeah, but we don't have visibility, or things are happening in the cotton supply chain in the manufacturing units, so we don't know. So we've gone from that extreme, literally, and putting the laws and regulations in place, which I feel are very welcome and useful, for at least companies, the focal companies, to take a little bit more responsibility, from what they have done. What we have not seen is the price that they should be paying for externalizing the costs. So we set up business practices and norms which were anyway deeply exploitative of the social and the environmental context in which they originated. I mean, the birth of fair trade, when was when Solidaridad and Nico would have gone to see what's happening, and you cannot say that that's happening in Mexico, and we are getting good coffee in the Netherlands and we are enjoying it. And I think a lot of that still holds true, which means uh, you're absolutely right that farmers are should be environmentally sustainable. A, the question is who's compensating for them. B, is the compensation adequate? C, if the eventual benefit of that is going to be a company to claim that, oh, we are net zero, or another country in Europe to say we are net zero, then is it fair? Because everybody has net zero emissions. And again, the moment you shift these credits across the border, you're changing the dynamics again. Fundamentally, if a country is doing its own activities towards net zero, the farmers, for instance, then to what extent should we get compensated because somebody else is doing something naughty and wrong for which they need these credits to offset something else. Um, and whether it's an offset, Shatadru, or an inset, I think these are mechanisms just to talk about traceability and through the supply chain, whether it's on the supply chain or off the supply chain, or whether we debated a lot about mass balance, as well as some of those other mechanisms in fair trade. And essentially, I think, again, the responsibility should not be resting with the farmers because they're still figuring out the best way to grow the tomatoes, the best coffee that they can produce. They have a lot of social issues. So I think burdening them with additional targets because somebody else has to meet their target is probably not fair.
Absolutely. So this is, again, the term fairness is the most important that keeps on coming back again and again, and somehow feel that the world is getting divided into different narratives of sustainability. There is a clear OECD narrative of sustainability. There is a narrative of southern democracies narrative, and then you have another group of who are like really underdeveloped. They have another kind of a narrative. So in this milieu, the question, there is an element that comes up. uh, let's look at, let's say, the voluntary carbon market. And here the issue is, how do you see that there's a value in itself? There are two issues. One is the businesses are themselves governing their own mechanism because they say they're hiring private auditors who are following private laws, which says this is carbon because there is a tree. And private auditors who are hired by the same firm who was getting their audit done, they're saying, yes, you are audited. And then the businesses trade among themselves while they, which allows them to do horrendous practice, for example, in Africa, and buy certificates, let's say, from Asia, or the vice versa. Is it a fair mechanism?
Yeah, and that's a very pertinent question. So I can tell you a couple of things. One is, so we've been at Practical Action, we've been doing some bit of credits for our clean cooking work in Nepal, and then we have been doing also credit related work for our regenerative agriculture in Africa. Now, very interestingly, the price points of the two are very different. And again, under the science-based target, what we are hearing is that the formulae for cleaner credits is different from the not so clean. So the more nuance you add to this, it gets much more complicated. And two things, complexity benefits those, like we said earlier, those who have an understanding, which means even for us, as even for me, to understand the nuances, sometimes it's just way too subtle. Uh, Two, because it's a small market, these are far from perfect markets, so the number of buyers and the number of sellers are limited. But predominantly, it's a buyer's market, which essentially means that the buyers are dictating the price at which it should happen. Whether you do that through a third party certification or a formula, it essentially means that whoever is buying has a greater hold on the sellers. The opportunity to produce credits, especially whether it's in clean energy or agriculture based, is phenomenal because especially in the most underdeveloped countries, predominantly agrarian societies, whereas the most developed countries are predominantly knowledge or service economies. That lack of parity will remain in defining the science-based target, the size of the market, the size of the pricing. And again, Shraddha, you're so right that it becomes extremely hard in the absence of a regulation, in the absence of homogeneity, in the absence of definitions, like I can put numbers. The entire financial crisis was not because people didn't know what their numbers were. I mean, there were huge models and numbers, and that was as science based in, whether in 87 or 2008, 2007 or 8, as we've seen. That doesn't necessarily make it right. So putting numbers, it's great intellectual stimulation, and I've been there, done that. I've done a few naughty things around that. So I fully understand that your heart and intent is there. And very quickly, and I worked in the carbon markets in about 2005, very briefly. One of the things, Shatadru, between then and almost 20 years hence, is that I don't see a fundamental paradigm shift, which means we have already started talking about futures and options. And it's very strange because the underlying asset, the carbon market itself, is so vague, unclear. It's highly volatile. The kind of classic VUCA in itself. And then we want to package that, what we don't understand, either as a black box. Some people say it's a crap box, and you put that crap, and then you want to package with a lot of ribbons and put futures and options and complex exotic stuff. And then very quickly you'll find yourself that farmers are delivering things which don't have value. There are platforms which were housed in the US, which had credibility issues. So the question is that before we get into making it more complex, can we look for mechanisms to make it more simpler that works? And I think that is fundamentally where we try to complicate things, because again, making it complex is power. But I think it's power to the farmers if we kind of make it simple.
And honestly, I mean, when I look at it, I see that there is a mechanism. Certification systems are resurrecting themselves through this carbon space. So there was a downhill journey of this traditional certification standards. Now, if you look at the world of the certification, everybody is offering either a plug-in or an additional element about through regenerative agriculture or through carbon, any other thing. But the problem is, and what we have witnessed again in the last 2 decades or so, that the benefits of the certified supply chain, and when you use the supply chain as a mechanism or uh, as a leverage in order to push sustainability, it is always captured by the very large well-to-do players. It's not surprise that most of the certification system, when you look at it, you will see really big players who are dominating the certified supply chain. Independent smallholders palm oil reaches European shores, certified palm oil. This is after 2 decades of interventions using public money. Now, in carbon, again, we are reaching. My worry is, and how whether you share this worry, and what would be your solution to that? I mean, I can share what I think about it afterwards, but uh, whether we would see a similar trajectory. Because as we talk, I see big industrial plantations are gearing up to face this new European Green Deal and carbon requirement, and they are well placed. They have scientists on their payroll. They have, they have their auditors on the payroll, and they can get things done, in no way. Is it going to become another tool for exclusion for smallholders as it goes forward? And whether should it not be the case that this entire carbon discussions with the net zero commitment should have also a very clear understanding that there should be a quota for smallholders in that, proportionate to their supply. Otherwise, you know using mass balance and other mechanisms, you will always exclude the smallholders from the benefits, that carbon potential benefits that carbon can bring for the smallholders. How do you see that as a kind of, well, should we not avoid the same mistakes we did, including you and me, 2 decades back? Should we do the same in carbon?
Yeah, so I share your fears, Shatadru. I mean, I hadn't realized it. So there are multiple levels to this, if I may say, fears. Even in certification, what we saw was that there was a huge, let's say, control and influence of the most powerful. It's not just the ABCDs, but anybody who controls the supply chain to have a say into that. And then they took certification, and then they created their own certification or standards and diluted and distorted it. Now carbon seems to be like the new hole to dig into. It seems like that new interesting space, and still talk about sustainability. So there is a lot of talk through social media, etc., etc. But I think the most vulnerable are those who still don't even know what that entire conversation is. Again, because knowledge, information, you said auditors, power, money, uh, is with those, and they will do almost anything to ensure that lack of parity or the status quo remains, which means the smallholders will remain small, impoverished decision makers, influencers into this conversation. Uh, whose responsibility is it to bring them? I would imagine that that's the best use of public money, whether through the governments, local governments, international aid, international governments. I think to create a level playing field for those who are not yet into the on the table to have that conversation. I think there is a role and space to play, and obviously all this money has to be done in partnership with implementing civil society organization like ours. I fundamentally believe that working with smallholder farmers is actually the most important and complicated, complex challenge at various levels, and I think that's where we should be looking at. While plantations and big companies have muscle power, I think that's a different game. It's like the organized versus unorganized sectors, literally. And I think the voice and the power, the influence should be given to the larger majority, which is actually at the bottom of the pyramid. So I definitely feel whether it's a conversation on data, whether it's a conversation on climate, whether it's a conversation on credits. I mean, any kind of credits. We're talking about carbon credits, but we can have water credits, plastic credits, and you can keep creating those things. But it should not be without those for whom we are deciding. So which means nothing about them should be without them. And when I say them, it should be the farmers, the smallholder farmers who are living in very abject poverty across the world.
If I have to draw some insight from that and you know add a little bit to it, you were said, the mechanism could be that European Green Deal comes up with a mechanism for ensuring that the farmers, smallholder farmers, of course, without going into those complexities of how you define a smallholder farmers, and that's nitpicking in my view. I mean, you get involved into family farmer, small farmer, FAO definition of a farmer, 5 hectare or 25 hectares. What happens to the South American farmers? They are family farmers, but their size are very big. I don't, without going into those kind of, you know, technical, taking refuge in those technical aspects, take the bull by horn and say that, the Europe, probably the deforestation, the Green Deal could be a global tool for inclusion of smallholder proportionate to their contribution to a particular commodity. Similarly, in the voluntary markets, where you are talking about the net zero commitment should also come up with a very clear and transparent, understandable way, reporting mechanism of how they are planning to include smallholders proportionate to their contribution in their commitment. So it's not enough to say that I'm my X amount of carbon is reduced, but by whom? So like what you stated, we should go reach out to the farmers, reach out to the people who matters.
Yeah, and Shatadru, you're so right, because I mean, there are 2 points to it, right? One, to say that I've reached my science-based target. The mechanism is important, because how have you extorted somebody else? So you've solved your environmental element, but you've distorted, further aggravated your social dimension to it. So is it coming by extortion? Is it coming by exploitation? And this could be economic exploitation. Sometimes it could be military, social exploitation. We've had governments in Middle East, oil-rich governments, literally buying a 1/3 or 1/5 of a country's land just for their carbon credits. These are new forms of extortion, extraction of value, colonization, etc. And the last thing we want is to create new problems for the old poor countries which have been struggling, especially in the agricultural context. So I think that mechanism, the means, is extremely important. How we do it, as much as the final outcome. And unless somebody tells me that, somebody tells me I've earned 100 million, I said, great, congratulations. How have you earned it? Well, I did XYZ. So now it could be anything. It could be legal, legitimate, gray areas, or it could be just pure brilliance. And my respect for that earning, very similar to the net zero, will depend on how have you acquired it.
And now, how do you feel about this transparent reporting mechanism? The civil society, do you feel, should have a role in holding these companies who have come up with net zero commitment accountable about the progress they are going to make on their net zero commitments, and in a transparent, understandable way of reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in all honesty, Shata, there are two things, right? There is this, like I said, externalizing the cost. So if you look at it from a pure balance sheet perspective, what very often we're doing is you're saying net zero, yes. While you've acquired those credits, which are questionable by formulae and valuation, etc., which is questionable, and you're saying, okay, you've reached your target. But what are the other things that you've done which is not accountable for? So there is a huge unaccounted for mechanisms in which we are doing it. So while the net zero, and it's not a fair, it's not a balanced sheet, because the accountability, the transparency, the information, and the reporting of one side of the balance sheet is not reflecting of the other side. And this is again fundamentally to the way we've seen society. You mentioned, pre 1971, this, that the only value of a company is, the only objective of a company, the Friedman said, is to create value for its shareholders. We've long since gone away from that. We talk about triple bottom line, etc., etc. So those are fairly discredited in modern discourse. We've seen a lot of calamities. And again, whether it's talking about the carbon markets, I think the level of accountability is not high enough. The level of transparency is not high enough. The formulae, everything is questionable, and I'm fine with it because there is a formula on the table. So that's a starting point. In similar ways that we started with certification to say that, look, we have some mechanisms, you can criticize it, but there is something to do with it. So there are formulae based on it. But I think there's a huge space for transparency that is required when any country, any company is reporting claiming a net zero, because again, the entire story of that credit, the journey from the origin, and very similar to how we talk about the fair trade movement, is from the origin to the destination to the claims, I think is extremely important.
I think as we are coming to the close end part of our discussion, I would like to close with one question, with last question. Probably there would be many of our audiences would be from the younger generation of professionals who have decided to make development cooperation as their preferred career choice. Uh, for them, when they are looking at, let's say, the time of 2030, how do you see, given the discussion we are having, what are the issues these young professionals will be addressing? Uh, the world, when I look at, let's say, 2019 or 2020, the issues were very different of what we are discussing today. Considering all the new dimensions which is happening, and this speed of change is even faster than what we used to witness, like between my development career starting from the year 2000 till 2019, maybe the speed was not so much as we will witness between 2020 to 2030. What would be your analysis of the development cooperation world, the role of civil society should be playing by the end of this decade in 2030, and this young professionals should be prepared for that?
Very good question, Shatadru. Again, at our time, most people who came into the civil society were people who studied sociology or arts or humanities. A lot of that has changed over the last 10 years. A lot of people have career switchers, so people with MBAs, people like myself, or people with technology backgrounds like myself. We started with a place of passion. I think in the future, three fundamental issues, I think 2030, or we are already seeing it, three fundamental issues will rise above all others. Issue of climate, issue of gender, and issue of technology. And when I say technology, I predominantly mean digital technology, whether it's about blockchain, AI, etc. And we've touched upon very interestingly about all three of them in today's. And I don't know whether you had kind of crafted it that way, but again, conversation revolved around all these three issues, and I'm sure you have it. But it's not surprising that these are the three largest issues which the next generation. My advice to the next generation, and I have to apologize to them because we are actually leaving them with all the problems that we and the previous generations have created. One of the worst things to do is that we are probably leaving them poorer as a starting point, just by virtue of the gender disparity, the gaps in climate commitments and not meeting the commitments. And technology, I mean, it can be a tremendous enabler or a disabler depending on how you wield that sword. My advice to them is to keep an eye on the broader spectrum. And again, that era of where, whether in investment banking, we used to talk about, it's the laissez-faire. You'd start looking at a society because there are elements of the society which sooner or later will influence you. COVID was a classic example where I could not say that I'm isolated from society because somebody else sneezes or somebody's irresponsible in wearing the mask has a direct impact on me. So that collective ownership, looking at a larger canvas, looking at a larger space is very important. And no matter what you study, and I've come to this conclusion, Shatadru, no matter what you study, you need to study a bit more holistically. So we stop studying everything from class 10 onwards, and we believe specialism is important, but I think there's a space to deepen that across multiple sectors. So you need to study technology, we need to study sociology, we need to study economics, we need to study finance, and we need to build and develop on those skills, because at the end of it, there's going to be an interplay of all of that. And again, I would very strongly advocate that we should have a strong civil society, because civil society historically has been and should be the conscience of the society. Nobody gives you a mandate per se, and it's a debate, Shatadru and I say, who's given us the mandate? You don't need that mandate sometimes. It's just the conscience of the society. Of course, there are difference of opinions between different organizations. Of course, there are difference of opinions between any individuals, a set of individuals, groups of individuals in different countries. But you still need that conscience. You need somebody to call out, to challenge, to address, to answer. NGOs are not always activists. There are large number of civil society organizations like that where we actually do practical action on the ground. We influence things. We by working with farmers with our target population. So you can choose the spectrum where you want to belong. How much of that should be advocacy? How much of that should be public policy? How much of that will be closely working with the government? But the space of civil society should not be shrunk or reduced. The space of civil society should remain. And I would say, given our challenges in environment, given our challenges in the society, given our challenges in understanding or not understanding technology, I think the space of civil society will change and probably should grow, if anything else.
That's so useful, Ayan. I think for many of our younger listeners who are, kind of getting initiated in the development cooperation world, this would be very inspiring. I mean, now that we have come to the end of our discussion, this discussion can continue with you, Ayan. It will go on for days if required, but because this is such a fascinating subject. But I think the kind of inputs you gave for and primarily drawing from your experience as a technocrat, as a economist, and as an activist for agriculture, working worked in the grassroots, this combination is very unique. And now as an NGO leader, and you've been an NGO leader for a while, be it in leading the fair trade or practical action or in Solidaridad. So this is a very unique combination which will help the youngsters to understand the nuances, and probably you were the best place to kind of dive into this subject. And that is the reason I wanted to start this podcast with you. Thank you so much for your time and for this fascinating, very engaging discussion. I hope our audience liked it. I would not suggest that just listen to it, please. Our idea is not to this discussion was not to give answers. We were both seeking, we're both trying to understand a phenomena which is out there, raise questions, problematize it. Not necessarily we'll always have the answers to those questions, but collectively we can all seek these questions and answers from you. And I would be very happy to respond to some of your questions if you have here. This podcast will, continue. I found it's a very, entertaining. It is very engaging even for me, and I hope Please let us know how can we improve this podcast further. But I think with this, I think we are coming to the end of our very first edition of EcoPulse. Thank you very much to you, Ayan, once again for participating.
Thank you. Very honored to be here. Thank you so much, Shatadru. Thank you.